Hey everyone, thanks for hopping on. I'm just going to give it a sec for everybody to join before we get started. So just sit tight for a couple minutes and we'll be with you. All right, it looks like the attendees joining is leveling off a bit. So why don't we get started? I'll do some quick introductions during the time that folks will be joining. So we can take a second. But as a bit of introduction, this is RadTech. It is a monthly webinar series hosted by the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, where we discuss a wide range of topics on surveillance technology, and social justice. We try to bring together community organizers and experts in these fields and specific subsets of these fields, and we discuss how surveillance technology is impacting our communities, what we can do to fight back, and more. So the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project was founded in 2019. It advocates for and litigates to abolish local government systems of mass surveillance. Our work highlights the discriminatory impact of surveillance on Muslim Americans, immigrants, the LGBTQ plus community, BIPOC individuals, and particularly unique trauma of anti-Black policing. My name is David Siffert. I'm the legal director of S.T.O.P. I'm going to introduce the two panelists we are very excited to have with us today. Evan Greer is director of Fight for the Future, a digital rights advocacy group. She's been organizing hard-hitting political campaigns for more than a decade, a talented writer. She's a regular contributor to numerous publications, including The Guardian, Newsweek, and Time magazine. Prior to joining Fight for the Future, she toured as a professional musician. She continues to create music and organize live music events. Rory Muir is Associate Director of Community Organizing at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, coordinating EFF support of local advocacy groups. Much of this work is done through the grassroots information sharing network, the Electronic Frontier Alliance. Prior to joining the EFF, Rory studied activist pedagogy and adolescent use of social media as a doctoral student of psychology. As a student, instructor, and researcher, they advocated for student and worker privacy, open science, and open education on campus. So today's panel is specifically about how to protect trans kids from digital surveillance. So we're going to be talking to these panelists about their advocacy for trans rights and for digital privacy. We're going to be looking at digital surveillance of transgender youth, but also other gender non-conforming, non-binary, intersex, and queer youth, especially in the light of increasingly transphobic legislation that's passing at the state level across the country. So before we get started and dive into specific questions, I just want to give each of the panelists a chance to sort of say what's on the top of their minds. I know that each of you is working on really important issues surrounding what we're talking about today. So Rory, do you want to get started and tell us a little bit about what's on your minds?
Yeah, sure. One of the really big issues that I'm concerned about in the past year, especially, is the role of school surveillance, particularly proctoring software and surveillance tools on student devices, being a means to out students, and the intersection that has with these local laws being passed and increasing this connection with students and law enforcement. And it's something that it follows this pattern of kind of shock doctrine. This big thing happens, and then all these deals get hastily signed without a lot of thought being put to privacy or kind of long-term impacts of this information being accessible to folks. And schools increasingly becoming carceral, driven by AI, surveillance, censorship as means to criminalize identity versus what it could be, all the good parts of the internet, of a space, countercultural space where people can feel safer and more connected to each other, and be a vital lifeline for trans youth that are at so much risk, not just from greater society, but even in their own household. So yeah, this intersection of surveillance instead of safety is really my big concern right now.
Cool. Yeah, and I can jump in and just add a little bit there. I mean, I think at the top of my mind on this topic is I think that I hope that the left is experiencing a wake-up call in this moment, and a reminder that activities that were not criminalized very recently can very suddenly become criminalized. And whenever we think about policies, whether it's around surveillance or around content moderation online, we should be making sure that those policies are future-proofed and can't be weaponized by our enemies to target the most vulnerable members of our community. And I think we're seeing that obviously with the very likely repeal of Roe v. Wade, where the activities of abortion seekers and people who provide abortions and other reproductive health care will very likely be further criminalized than they already are in many states, and where surveillance will be the mechanism through which that oppression is enforced. And we see that with this wave of anti-trans legislation as well, where a wide range of activities, some of which could include simply posting information on the internet, could be criminalized, or is currently actively, folks are attempting to criminalize that activity. And so I think that that's important because I think especially during times when people are really scared, they tend to cling to institutions of authority. We saw this a lot during the Trump era, where kind of the center left became very enamored with the FBI and surveillance, or even I've heard folks say, like, I'm really glad that they used facial recognition to catch the folks that stormed the Capitol. And I think we just need to be really, really cautious and remember that if you look from here back throughout history, you can follow a direct line where surveillance and censorship are always tools of the power of those in power, and they're tools to maintain the status quo. And unless you believe that the status quo of this exact moment is like perfect and we should just freeze ourselves in time, which I don't think anyone believes, you should be part of the movement that's actively opposing expansions of both government and corporate surveillance, and fighting for policies that ensure free expression for a wide range of folks online. So I'll pause there, but I can obviously say a lot more.
And I definitely want to hear a lot more, especially on the interaction of increased criminalization and increased surveillance. But I do want to go back to one specific thing you said. So you talked about future-proofing, and I'm interested in the concept of future-proofing, and I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you mean by future-proofing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and Rory, feel free to jump into, but one thing I always kind of ask myself is just like a litmus test for a policy is like I look back and I ask, like, if the Black Panther Party was active today, how would this policy play out for them? Or if the US government had this type of surveillance capability at the time when homosexuality and distribution of materials about homosexuality were still criminalized in most states in the country, how would this have played out? Would our LGBTQ rights movement have been able to form? Or would the leaders of that movement have been, who met in secret in people's homes and in cafeterias and in bars, sometimes with the protection, of shady people, have been arrested, and our movement never could have gotten off the ground, right? And so I think looking back and asking yourself, how would these policies apply to, your heroes, your political heroes, can be very helpful, especially when you start to get into, again, I know we're focused on surveillance today, but for me, I do this a lot around content moderation and speech. When I think about, tendencies to want to crack down on or criminalize or silence speech that I disagree with, I always ask myself, well, how are we talking about that in a specific enough way that it would not have led to the silencing of people that I idolize as having fought for liberation? And so to me, that future-proofing it's a funny thing where it's actually sort of about looking backwards, thinking about how policies play out, and then looking forward to imagine, what happens if someone like Trump is in charge of the FTC? What happens if someone like Trump is in charge of the FBI, et cetera? And then ask yourself whether this policy still sounds like a good idea.
And Rory, I know that EFF has done a lot of amazing work doing, I think, a lot of what what Evan is describing. I'm wondering if right now you all have any specific, let's say, policies that you feel are important in a future-proofing mission.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to plus one everything Evan said. I think there is this tendency with sometimes we call it the shiny object, but I do think the framing of shock doctrine that, you want to do something very quickly, especially as activists, you want to react to something, but kind of making the space to not always be reactive and positively asserting basic protections and thinking about how are these tools of control, as Evan said, used in the past or used currently on more marginalized groups. How does this tool look like in the context of a prison versus a school? And often there's a lot of parallel there. So I think, approaching these things from a sort of policy conservative angle, a big thing that we're a fan of is the Biometric Information Privacy Act in Illinois, and would like to see policies like that be more widely spread, where uniquely identifying information of biometrics like face recognition be banned from government use, and in private use highly restricted. As an example of not going overboard, and I think similar things in the crypto space pop up. So kind of iterating to identify the harm and implement a solution that we know for sure won't be misused against folks in the future.
So then going back to what Evan said about increasing criminalization, I feel like a lot of times privacy advocates have struggled to make the point why privacy is so important in the face of the response like, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, why do you need your privacy? But as these new developments of criminalization of conduct that some of us, I think, know are basic human rights, like gender-affirming care, as these things become criminalized, I think the case becomes a lot stronger. How can you, I'll start with Evan, can you unpack a little bit what you were saying before about this increasing wave of criminalizations and how that interacts with privacy and surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, just it helps to get a little concrete here, and I think again, this has been, I don't even want to say helpful because it's a terrifying situation, right? But I do think it makes it more real for people who have had the privilege to feel like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, like nothing bad is going to happen to me and my family, to start to understand like, oh, all parents of trans children who live in Texas like have a real conundrum on their hands right now and are actively afraid of everything they've posted on social media in the past potentially being used against them, of the potential subpoena power of attorneys general who could, very likely access all kinds of potential information that they've sent electronically without even a warrant necessarily, if certain types of activities are criminalized. And I think that's the thing to understand, is just that threat models can change. And we, tend to often think like, well, all right, I'm not doing anything that's going to get me in trouble with the FBI. So if I'm, texting with my friends about smoking weed and, organizing a banner drop or whatever, like whatever, it's not a big deal. But remembering that can change. And when activities are criminalized, the ability for an attacker to access your information through legal means dramatically increases. And to me, this also points out why the industry-backed model of notice and consent is utterly insufficient. And and we're this is our point of perhaps gentle disagreement between Fight for the Future and EFF on things like facial recognition, where we agree, we like the Illinois law, and we think that more states should have a law like that as like a bare minimum to a harm reduction measure. But we also believe that there are certain types of surveillance that people can't meaningfully consent to. And that the tech industry especially has made sort of a mockery of this concept of consent, We understand in romantic relationships, you can't consent to your boss. You can't consent when you're intoxicated. You can't consent to someone if they are misrepresenting to you their health status or other information about them, right? Tech companies are doing all of those things. And this concept of notice and consent sort of fails to contend with the power dynamics in our society. If you're a small business owner or a working queer musician, you might not have a choice about whether you stream on Twitch or not, because that's where your audience is and you depend on that to pay the bills, right? And so I think I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit here, but for us broadly, these bills and this wave of attacks on basic rights show why in the end, we support, again, every harm reduction measure along the way. But in the end, what we need are broad prohibitions on companies collecting so much data about all of us in the first place. Because once that data is collected, it exists in kind of the ether. It is a massive attack surface for, not just law enforcement, but, as we've seen with some of how these bills are crafted, potentially also vigilantes. We've seen, with more on the reproductive justice side, but legislation that's crafted to essentially encourage people to snitch on each other, where a religious institution could purchase cell phone location data about people and use it to attack them, snitch them out, bully them, harass them. There's just limitless kind of possibility for abuse once you allow companies to collect data in the first place. And so from where Fight for the Future sits, we support broad prohibitions on collection and data harvesting in the first place, broad prohibitions on abusive and discriminatory uses of data. And we think that that's the legislative framework that we need in the end, although we will kind of fall back on sort of a very strict notice and consent model as a harm reduction tactic or stepping stone from here to there.
Right on. And I think a few things you said I want to lift up as well. Of you mentioned attack surface, and just for folks who aren't familiar with security planning, it's kind of your exposure to this risk in the digital space. And I think it's, as you pointed out, looking at the variety of threats folks are facing. I have a background as a digital security trainer at Blue Stockings, New York, for folks that are fans of Blue Stockings. Yeah, folks will say things like, oh yeah, the NSA doesn't care what I'm saying or doing, but maybe the local police department does. Maybe your parents who have access to your devices are really interested in what you're saying. So kind of thinking of the variety of how this surveillance is used, it's not purely just the most powerful tier. There are many axes of power that it might be used against you on. And I particularly like the framing of data as a toxic asset as well, that even if the surveillance isn't intentionally being used in this way, I think it usually is, but even when it's just kind of like, might as well collect it type of data, as it collects, even if you trust the authority that is collecting it, it becomes more and more dangerous because all of this information is out there. You're more susceptible to something like a breach. So maybe you do trust the government with XYZ information. But then if that database becomes public, are you okay with right-wing extremist groups having that same information, or left? And excuse me. You have to be okay with that information being out there to potentially a much bigger audience than you expect, and for a longer time. Again, the government leadership does change. So do you trust today's leadership same as yesterday and tomorrow's?
So I want to throw out a specific example of a problem to concretize this. I think we've had a few throughout this, and it's the one that's been really sticking in me, and we talked about this a little bit right before, which is these bans on gender-affirming care for youth, particularly I think morally offensive to a lot of us, treating, a necessary aspect of being good parents as child abuse. But it creates a particularly big policy problem because we have, for example, police have the ability to seek geofence warrants, which give geolocation data of all the people who went to a specific facility and everywhere they've been recently. And you could imagine Texas seeking that kind of a warrant for a facility in New York that provides gender-affirming care. and then using that against the Texas parent when they return home, and even a constitutional claim that Texas can't criminally regulate what people do out of state might not survive if you're talking about what they deem to be child abuse, where I think probably there's substantial precedent that child abuse done out of state would be admissible in state in terms of determining what to do with a child. Obviously, it's turning the idea of child abuse on its head, but if that's the view of the courts, what do we do about this? There's a bill in New York State to ban New York State authorities using geofence warrants in New York, but that wouldn't prevent Texas law enforcement from seeking an extrajudicial warrant in the Texas court to cover data that took place in New York. So, like, what on a policy level do we do? And I can see this potentially being the type of clash that you were talking about earlier. Is this a do we require federal legislation? Is it about the storage of the data? Is it about the transmission of the data? What's the best? And we have to pick a tactic because we want to align in terms of where we put the pressure. So, where should we do it?
So I can jump in quickly and just say that broadly speaking, Fight for the Future sort of takes a two-prong approach to our surveillance work. So one is, or I guess actually it's really a three-prong approach. One is teach people how to defend themselves, and we depend on folks like Rory, who are better experts perhaps even than we are, to do that. But encouraging folks to take those basic steps to protect themselves. The second is slowing down the spread of kind of abusive surveillance technologies and running campaigns to encourage corporations to take steps to safeguard people's data. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that. Sometimes I get the pushback of well, what, you're going to depend on Google to do the right thing? And it's no, I'm not going to depend on them, but I'm sure as heck going to beat up on them and try and get them to take steps. And those steps can be significant. When WhatsApp, flipped a switch and billions of people's communications suddenly became end-to-end encrypted, you can yell about WhatsApp all you want, but that concretely benefits a lot of people and likely saved a number of lives actively. And we should not underestimate the impact of pressuring corporations to do better while we fight for policies to make sure that they do. And so that's the third prong, is sort of if we can slow down the spread of both surveillance technologies and make over collection of data politically toxic, that gives us time to fight for the types of policies that we need to make that mandatory across the board and backed in a real way. But in the end, I guess it's sort of also, perhaps just my anti-authoritarian nature that I don't really trust the government to do a good job at that. I don't really trust the companies to do a good job at that. So I kind of keep all of that in my view all at the same time and try and push all three forward where possible. To get a little specific on that, this is more, again, on the reproductive justice side, but, we've been leading an open letter campaign to Google, pressuring them to stop unnecessarily collecting location data, echoing the demands of a letter sent by 42 lawmakers last week, where there's a very specific type of location data that Google is collecting on Google Maps and other applications that Apple is not collecting. That doesn't mean Apple's a good company and Google's a bad company. They're both bad companies. But what that means is that there is a real and meaningful opportunity to pressure Google to clean up its act on this one specific thing that would actually legitimately make it harder to criminalize people who are seeking reproductive health care and people who are seeking gender-affirming care. And we have a unique moment right now where we can pressure them to do it, where lawmakers are calling on them, civil society groups are calling on them, and hopefully their own employees will be calling on them to make this change. That's not a solution. That's a harm reduction measure, but it's one that we think is worth fighting for to give us time to fight for the types of comprehensive surveillance reform and broad prohibitions on data collection that I spoke about before.
I think S.T.O.P just signed on to that letter today.
Sweet. Thank you.
Rory, what about you? What are your thoughts? What should we be prioritizing?
I feel like I'm just always agreeing with Evan. But yeah, I totally agree. And I think, again, to speak to my background as educator, that, yeah, moving away from the framing of individual liberation to collective liberation, that I think one of the first steps to protecting yourself, we often point to our lovely resource, the Violence Self-Defense.eff.org. But I really think the first step is reaching out to like-minded folks, trusted contacts in your life, and starting to make it a shared practice with others, that this sort of protection, no one's an island, and privacy is a team sport, and really working in communities. And that ties to my work with Electronic Frontier Alliance, lovely groups like S.T.O.P are a part of, and finding the community organizers to, again, then make momentum after assuring some personal protections, and make some momentums to put pressure on companies and legislators to kind of install more permanent protections. So yeah, totally agree with Evan's framing there.
Yeah, yeah, +1 +1 +1. But quickly, I'll also just add on the personal side, and I love that framing of collective defense and collective liberation rather than individual. And I think that's so important, because that individualist framing of this is so futile, of like, well, if you don't like it, then don't use Facebook. Like, that's just utterly unhelpful for the vast majority of people. And so I think that's really important. And the other thing I'd say on that front is that, like, the first step toward digital security is to like take a deep breath and like not feel shame. I think shame is like one of the most unhelpful emotions in this front, that like we all feel like, oh man, I know I like shouldn't use the same password for everything, but like I've been doing it for so long and I feel really bad about it, but like it's scary to take that first step. And I just think it's really important that we get past like trying to shame each other into like taking these steps, and into like inviting each other in, supporting each other in taking these steps. And then to like the flip side of that is like remembering that like your security is your community's security. And maybe, you're not worried about, your own safety or, your own activities being criminalized, but you really never know whether like something that someone texted you just saying like, oh, hey, I'm, going to be at this event or something, or I'm going to go to this protest, could then get used against them. And then you could be the weak link that puts your community in danger. And so that's sort of a duality of like, don't be ashamed, don't feel guilty, but also remember that it's not just you that you're protecting, and that, we need to do this together, not individually.
Yeah, I think another framing is like hygiene, that you don't have to be ashamed if you missed a few showers or something, but taking action and improving the situation for yourself and your community is the point.
I really love this framing, and my next question was gonna be like, what can each person do to protect themselves? But I think you've said it much better, which is sort of what can we all do to protect ourselves as a community? If you are a queer youth out there, how can you and your friends go about protecting each other? What specific actions can you all take? Whether it's, is it password related? Is it, what browser you use? Is it what settings you use? Are there any specific things that apps? What should people be aware of? What are some of the top priority things for queer youth out there to protect themselves?
Yeah, I could start that. So yeah, like I said, I think reaching out to trusted contacts, and it's a tricky piece of advice because not everyone has that, unfortunately. But if you do, going through the process together, there are a lot of great resources. I plugged ssd.eff.org. And the first practice that is put there is to put together a security plan. And a security plan requires no technical experience. It requires no legal experience. It just, a lot of folks are expert on taking care of themselves. If you lock the door on your way out, you're already doing security planning. So I think starting there and kind of narrowing your focus, because as Evan said, it can be extremely overwhelming, and people get into this point where they're panicked and overwhelmed with what to do. And doing something like security planning is all about asking yourself, all right, what are the main important things I need to work on? And then prioritizing those things, and slowly over time, finding tools that are better alternatives to the ones you're using, finding better settings for the tools that you have to use. And a thing I'm really a fan of is spring cleaning, digital spring cleaning of go through your phone and your computer and delete things you're not using, and reduce that attack surface as much as you can. So I think that's like something you could do. Get coffee with a friend over the weekend, and you could do that starting now. And then just kind of make it a practice and get more and more in depth with it. Maybe make it a group as well.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with all of that, and would say that that's the right step. Like we could sit here and be like, well, you should use Signal and you should make sure you have a passcode and and like all of that is true ideally, but really it's about figuring out what your threat model is and just taking a few steps. And I think for most queer youth, their threat model is probably more like their mom, their teacher, their like ex-partner who they texted nudes to and now has them, than it is like the NSA. And so there's a different set of steps that you take to protect yourself, from those types of actors. And in a lot of cases, they're much easier steps, right? It's about using disappearing messages. It's about, just again, having a good passcode on your phone for starters, that your mom doesn't know, it's, so I think it's, just sort of like, if that's a worry for you, and you don't have a supportive household. And so I think it's really important to just like understand that context and not like try and have a one size fits all plan, but really meet people where they're at and support them in taking the steps to protect themselves and their community.
To shift back to policy for a second, I'm just wondering. I'm a real like legislative policy wonk. Is there one bill, two bills, federal government, New York, any state legislature, city council, anywhere that you're all particularly eyeing? I know that the Illinois bill that just passed may be one of them. You can talk a little bit about the importance of that bill, maybe something that people can organize around, call their legislators about, something like that. Start with Rory, why not?
Sure. Yeah, I think one bill we're really excited about in California to lift up is the Student Test Taker Privacy Protection Act, which, as I mentioned, these surveillance tools being installed on school devices, and school devices is sometimes used as a personal device, importantly to note, that this test-taking software needs to provide basic data privacy protections to the students actually using them. Apps like Proctorio, ProctorU, ExamSoft, collect a wide manner of student data that, as we talked about with digital, as data as a toxic asset, can later be used against youth or later leaked. And yeah, I think this is a great bill that is moving forward. So if you're near California, please look out for opportunities to promote that and see if there's a webpage I can share to the stream.
Cool. Yeah. And I would say, despite a certain e-proctoring company's attempts to harass us, Fight for the Future is a big supporter of that bill and other attempts to rein in educational surveillance technology. But I would also just add, we are big supporters of the biometric surveillance moratorium bill that was introduced at the federal level, which would essentially temporarily ban all government and law enforcement use of facial recognition and other biometric surveillance in the United States. It's something that I think, to be real honest with folks watching, is unlikely to move this Congress, but is something that could lay the groundwork for the type of policy that we need in the future, and that could use more co-sponsors. So it really just encouraging folks to reach out to their senators and House reps and tell them to co-sponsor that bill. I think it's the Biometric Technology Moratorium Act of 2021, maybe, I don't know. And then beyond that, I think, again, there are harm reduction measures, things like the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, which Senator Wyden introduced, which would crack down on law enforcement purchasing data that they wouldn't otherwise be able to obtain without a warrant. We know, for example, ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, has purchased data from data brokers rather than going through legal means because it was basically just easier for them to do it that way. So closing that loophole is a positive step. But in the end, what we really need is a comprehensive national data privacy law. And again, one that is built on broad prohibitions of corporate surveillance rather than one that's, just sort of another checkbox you have to check to allow companies like Facebook and Amazon to do whatever the hell they want with your data.
Well, I think in about 10 minutes, I'm going to want to open it up to Q&A. Feel free, audience members, to start sending in your questions now via the Q&A function. But I want to give each of you a chance to give sort of like final thoughts before we shift to Q&A to see if you have any last wrap-up thoughts, whether it be legislative policy, communal action, whether there's specific types of surveillance you're currently worried about. Let's start with Evan.
Yeah, I mean, I think, since we're specifically talking about trans and queer and gender nonconforming young people here, I did want to lift up something that I think has been a tension and a challenge within the digital rights and kind of corporate accountability community, where, folks sort of understand that if you're trying to get something done in Congress, it always helps to slap a protect the children frame on it. And I think, what's incredibly important, and when we actually talk to people who are doing support for trans youth and, queer and trans folks in states where gender affirming care is being criminalized, and, marginalized trans and queer folks, what we see is that it's essential that we ask ourselves not just how do we sanitize the internet and make it safe for kids, but rather what policies are needed to create the type of world that we want our kids to grow up in, which is a world with basic human rights, where kids feel safe expressing themselves, a world where kids have a say in their democracy and their future. And I think that it's important because if we ask ourselves, just sort of like, how do we make the internet better for kids? That could lead to policies that actually make the world worse for kids. And I think that, making sure we're asking the right questions makes sure that we end up with the right outcomes. If we implement policies that perhaps lead to slightly less harmful content on social media platforms, but also kneecap the youth-led climate justice movement and mean that my kid and my kids' don't actually have a livable planet to live on, we're not helping kids. We're just saying we're helping kids while pushing for opportunistic policies that seem easy to get through Congress, but aren't necessarily what our kids need. And so as a parent and as someone who cares deeply about the future and a future where people have basic human rights, I just think it's essential that we reframe the questions we're asking from, what policies are needed to make the internet better for kids, to this broader question of what policies are needed to lead to the type of world that we want our kids to grow up in.
I think that's so smart because you get these, especially law enforcement, are so good at saying, think of the kids, think of trafficking, right? It's always human trafficking, it's always the kids, which are sort of used as these bogeymen to shut down the types of policies that are specifically helpful for those and other marginalized communities. Policies like over surveillance are the type of things that I think sex workers are much more worried about than the ability of police officers to crack down on what they perceive of as trafficking. And similarly, things that are done for the kids to protect the kids, if you actually ask kids, are not often policies that kids feel like benefit them. And I think the framing that you're giving is such an important one for explaining why that might be the case. So I really appreciate that. Um, Rory, what about you? What are your closing thoughts before we head to the Q&A portion?
Yeah, definitely. And I think on that point, yeah, looking to law enforcement to protect youth, has the inherent flaw of often being a higher risk to youth, particularly trans youth, than peers or members of LGBTQ community that these people are acting like are the real threat with things like the Don't Say Gay bill, that a teacher mentioning being gay or trans is like a grounding to be kicked out, and it is a concentrated effort to erase trans people from society, and that's where we hit the intersection again with digital. I want to highlight the censorship and restrictions to access to knowledge that a lot of these bills are also facing. That again, a school device that you might have or just at school can totally filter out what you're allowed to write or look for online. And of course, with tools like Bark, it's often you're not allowed to look up trans because it's inappropriate. But then if someone sends you a message recruiting you to the KKK or other hate groups, that's all right because it's working as intended in that case. So this importance of information, particularly for trans youth, this information is already being restricted in popular culture, already being pushed in the public sphere to not exist. That the internet and schools, I would say, but especially the internet, is a lifeline to youth for expression and identity formation. And yeah, in addition to the threat of outing and interactions with law enforcement, there's the restriction of information that I really see as insidious.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet, so I'm looking forward to them. If anyone has any, please do enter it. But I do have sort of a follow-up to that specifically because in the bill I mentioned that would ban geofence warrants in New York, it also ban reverse keyword search warrants. And that's something that I think relates a lot to what you were just talking about. It's a technology that lets police give a warrant for everybody who searched Google for a certain term. And I think the dangers of that with respect to LGBT youth are somewhat obvious. But can you talk a little bit more about how that interacts with what you're saying?
Yeah, definitely. It certainly makes things like searching about trans issue a thought crime or inherently incriminating. And it's even in the cases where it's not implemented, the threat of it being there serves as the panopticon of affecting your behavior and chilling. For every time it is used, there are many, many times that trans youth will be too scared to search for those things and deny themselves life-saving medical knowledge or just life-saving mental health resources because they're too scared to even look for it. So I think the chilling effect of those policies is, puts trans youth at risk, frankly.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think it's really important to state that the chilling effect is the point, right? That is the goal. And that's true with criminalization of trans youth. And it's true with criminalization of people trying to access reproductive care that, and I think that's also why it's really important that we as advocates be specific and be cautious in our messaging, because I think, as of right now, abortion is legal in every state in the United States, but there are people who are already worried about searching for things because they're hearing that their searches may be used against them. And so I just think it's again, this is where and I think Rory is absolutely right that it has to be about community, because it has to be about getting quality information out to people who are trusted within their community. Because there is so much information flying around and it can be really scary and overwhelming. And, especially trans youth who have been marginalized, who face discrimination, may feel like they don't know who to trust. And so, but I would just encourage everyone to be cautious about spreading fear and to focus instead on spreading good information about what people can do to protect themselves and make sure that we're not kind of just like, waving our hands and making kids afraid to seek out support, kids who need support, because I totally agree with that.
So we do have a question in the Q&A, which I think this is actually a good time for it, which is, how can audience members get involved in their respective organizations? So how would someone get involved with the future? How would someone get involved with the event?
I can go first. So Fight for the Future, you can find us on all the places and sign up. You know, if you sign any of our petitions and check the box, you'll get on our email list, and that's probably the best way to keep in touch with the issues that we're working on. You know, we've struggled as a very small organization to have kind of a volunteer core, but we do, you know, folks reach out to us and volunteer sometimes. And, you know, I'm easy to find on Twitter and anywhere else, and feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in supporting our work. Give us money too, if you have it.
Definitely. Yeah, similarly, we have AFF has a newsletter, supporters.eff.org, that you can sign up for to stay in the loop with our work. We also have a volunteer page, which doesn't have a nice URL, I'm realizing, but if you go to the EFF About, you'll see opportunities to volunteer. And then I think the big one for my team is, if you are in a community group or interested in starting a community group, going to eff.org/EFA. And we have some resources there about, we have some toolkits for folks that are new to organizing a community group, and they can look to some tips for getting started and getting to work on that. But then you can always email organizing@eff.org. And yeah, we prioritize groups that are in our alliance, the Electronic Frontier Alliance, but we're always happy to help with other organizers and connect them to coalition partners. Yeah, and connect you to the resources you need if you reach out.
For S.T.O.P, the answer is, I think somewhat similar to Fight for the Future, because we are also a small and newer nonprofit. So obviously you can follow us on social media. Please reach out. I would say right now, if you're in New York especially, we have two main priorities. The first is, in the city council, we are trying to pass pretty broad bans on biometric surveillance, especially facial recognition technology. We'd like to ban government use, residential use by landlords, and public accommodation uses, for example, in stores. So if you can call your council member and tell them this is important to you, that is a way to help us. In the state legislature, our priority bill for this session is the geofence warrant ban bill. It is pending in both the Senate and the Assembly. It would ban geofence warrants, it would ban keyword search warrants, and it would ban law enforcement purchases of this data to try to get around getting the warrants. So if you can call your senator and call your assembly member and tell them that that's an important bill to you, would be really helpful. And we are also part of a lot of coalitions around bills that we support. There's a privacy coalition that works on facial recognition technology. There's a gangs coalition that's trying to abolish the informal and probably unconstitutional gangs database that NYPD has. There's a Break the Shackles coalition. There's the Justice Roadmap coalition that works on criminal justice reforms more broadly. These are all really important coalitions working on a lot of really important legislation in New York. So getting involved in these coalitions is a great way to build support. So you can either join any of the participating organizations, you can join on your own, you can, like Rory was talking about, start a community organization on your own and then have that organization join one of these coalitions. So there's all sorts of ways that you can get involved, especially if you have a specific issue or a specific bill that you're passionate about. I think that would be important. So that would be my answer to that. So then I don't see any other questions in the Q&A right now. So if there are, great. I guess, why don't I ask this? Like, we've talked a lot about the problems, we've talked about some legislation, we've talked about some things that people can do on sort of community level, do you have sort of like a more philosophical front on this? There's I think Evan really hit hard on this, which is Evan talked a lot about power and how power is relevant here in terms of people in America really have this angle of consent, this angle of, you know, free contract, sort of libertarian idea of how we engage with each other, which can be useful sometimes in terms of allowing people to make their own decisions in the face of some conservative responses to that. But there, I think Evan started to hit on the limits of it in terms of the way power isn't often accounted for in that typical like liberal / libertarian mindset. Can you talk a little bit about how that is particularly relevant here in the field in digital surveillance, especially with digital surveillance of queer youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it kind of cuts in a couple different directions for me on this. So I think, to me, the failure of that liberal with a capital L kind of conception of consent is, as you just described, that it fails to contend with power dynamics in our society. And just to make that concrete, if your local doctor's office uses facial recognition when you go in, and the other closest doctor's office is 100 miles away, and you break your leg, and you walk in the office and there's a big sign that says, by walking in this office, you consent to having your biometric information collected, that's not meaningful consent. You have a broken leg, you got to go to the doctor. You're not going to drive 100 miles away. And, you know, that's sort of a very obvious example, but you can imagine sort of that coming all the way down to, there are 2 lines at the music festival and you could wait in the really long line, or you could go through the really fast line and consent to having your biometric information collected, right? But I think at a higher level for me, and this is sort of what I was getting at previously when I talked about looking back at movements of the past, privacy and freedom from surveillance is, to me, not so much about what we have to hide, but our ability to evolve as a human society. And to test whether the rules and norms, whether those are laws or just social norms that we have, are correct. And so, to give an example, you know, obviously the LGBTQ rights movement is a big one, where starting tomorrow on June 1st, every major corporation in the United States is going to change their logo to a rainbow and talk about how much they love gay people. And that is problematic and frustrating, but it's also the product of an extremely successful social movement that has moved mountains in terms of what is considered a norm in our society. And that was only able to happen because people had space that was free from both government and societal surveillance. There was private spaces where queer and trans and gender non-conforming people met, organized a movement, and then came out into the light to fight for the basic rights that many of us now enjoy today. If we have total surveillance, if we freeze things as they are by limiting online expression, or by trying to crack down or kind of use these surveillance type tools to mitigate harm, what we end up doing is preventing ourselves from evolving as a society. And then we get stuck. And we wouldn't be having a national conversation about whether criminalization of drugs is appropriate. We wouldn't be having a national conversation about whether mass incarceration or even policing as an institution is the right way to accomplish societal safety and goals, because we would assume that our norms that we have currently must be correct, and there wouldn't be space to challenge them. And so for me, fighting against surveillance and fighting against censorship is about fighting for that space to test our societal norms so that we can create better ones and create a better future.
Yeah, I'll add on. Yeah, totally agree. And I think, I think you touch on the concept of free spaces from sociologist Francesca Poeta, that it is about creating this space where these hegemonic forces, where the established rule aren't dictating what the norms are. And I think particularly the LGBTQ community relate and have a deep history in those spaces where you're again, want to be erased from the public sphere so you can form these kind of pockets. And that I think I've said a few times now of technology like the internet has been a lifeline and greatly empowering to folks to find those kind of counter spaces and form these countercultures by wielding technology. I'm pessimistic and tend to think that technology is pursued to intensify power, as my Twitter bio says. But I think there's also a component of technology for liberation, particularly from more community hacker type projects. And I think the internet kind of speaks to that, it's maybe silly to cite, but Tumblr has been really important for the LGBTQ community and having a space to kind of question norms and start new norms. And when surveillance enters the picture, those spaces get eliminated, and that freedom of spirit also gets eliminated.
Just one last question that's sort of, I think, building off of what you're talking about now, and I think is relevant, which is, and there's been a lot of talk about this, but sort of the privatization of the public sphere, where, conversations in public used to happen in public, but now conversations in public happen on privately owned platforms. What's the implication of that? I mean, obviously there's surveillance implications of that. There are free speech implications of that. What does that mean for us?
It's bad. To me, this is where I become, where my like crypto skeptic meets my belief in decentralization as a concept, and where I think, the idea of protocols instead of platforms, as Mike Masnick has put it, I think makes a tremendous amount of sense. That, we have and to break that down, for non-technical folks like myself, we all sort of understand like SMS and email. SMS is a protocol that telecom companies use for text messaging. And whether you have an iPhone or an Android, you can send an SMS to anybody that has a phone. Whether you use Gmail or a more privacy conscious service like Proton Mail, you can send an email to anybody that has email. That's a protocol. And we could imagine social media or other online services being organized more in that manner, where instead of spaces being kind of wholly controlled by private companies, you could have kind of the infrastructure, which still needs to be maintained in some manner. And, and there's often resources involved in that, which is where we start to get into, whether they're, a tokenized method of funding something like that makes sense or just is a mess or whatever. But, setting aside all of those specifics, I think the broad concept that, reclaiming public space through decentralized, open source, community governed technology projects, I think is sort of a prerequisite for having meaningful free expression in the future. And that in the meantime, we're just sort of squabbling over the crumbs, or, we can and should fight for harm reduction with the environment that we have now. And I think people can and should have meaningful disagreements, and people can agree to disagree or run their calculus differently on what the appropriate harm reduction measures are in this environment of very centralized surveillance capitalist social media giants. But in the end, it's all harm reduction in either direction until we can put ourselves on a path toward a future where, the majority of public conversation doesn't happen on platforms that are owned by a very tiny handful of people.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And to combine two things of decentralization, which I work on a bit at EFF, as well as VR and the metaverse, I think are an interesting pairing because I think things like competitive compatibility and interoperability, meaning that if you want to talk to someone on Facebook, currently you have to have a Facebook account, and having ways to be able to contact them in the same way that email is, that you don't have to have a Gmail account to contact someone with a Gmail account. That kind of basic compatibility lets people have way more choice and not be as trapped in these networks as they can be. And then I think when we look at these chilling effects of surveillance in the future of the metaverse, if you think that'll take off, I'm not entirely sure if it will, but when you look at that, it's not just what you type that is being regulated or mediated rather by these corporations, but the way you say it and your body language while you're saying it, and all these kind of other components of expression get collected and surveilled, and the dominant norms get further reified. So I think it's a crucial point to push for more competitive and decentralized protocols for the future of the internet.
I think that's a great place to end, right on the nose at 7. So thank you so much, Rory. Thank you so much, Evan. I learned a ton from both of you, so hopefully the attendees and audience members did as well. Really appreciate your all being here. Please do look up the work for EFF and Fight for the Future. They are doing incredible things for not just LGBT and queer youth, but the country as a whole, I would say. So please continue to support them both. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate your being here. I hope you all have a great night.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Happy Pride.